So as we heard yesterday from both the Biden administration, all the stars were out before the Senate Appropriations Committee. SecDef Austin and Christopher Wray, FBI director, and of course animatronic Anthony Blinken making the case for this holistic, comprehensive approach to foreign aid, $106 billion worth to Ukraine, that's the majority of it, to Israel, to Taiwan, to the border.
Oh, yeah, sure, the border.
And McConnell over in the Senate, representing the Republicans, at least some of them, making the case that, yeah, we're going to do something serious on the border, and that'll make Democrats have to swallow hard. So then Republicans who are skeptical of another 60 some odd billion dollars to Ukraine will swallow hard on that. Well, I thought we had an interesting discussion, really good discussion with Leo Leibovitz on yesterday's program. He's the editor-at-large at Tablet, Israeli immigrant and former academic. I mean, he argues that we should not provide funding to Israel. And he's not saying that because we shouldn't be allied with Israel against Hamas and in furtherance of eradicating Hamas. Of course he believes that. I mean, he had pointed words for what's happening on college campuses and the middling rhetoric of the D.C. press corps. He made a different argument as to why the U.S. shouldn't worry about $14 billion being sent over. They should just focus on sort of the cultural and political leadership that's required to support Israel. Take a listen.
I wrote a piece in July calling on America to end military support to Israel right away. Military support to Israel is really just a form of backdoor subsidy to American defense contractors. Israel doesn't need it. Israel actually loses more than $1 billion every year simply because it is forced to buy American products rather than develop its own weaponry and weapon systems. What I want to see, what I believe so many of your listeners also want to see, is a reality in which no American lives are ever threatened by these conflicts abroad. I want to see a reality in which Israel is free and unfettered to defend its own interests. I want to see a reality in which America understands who its real enemies are and stands fierce to Iran.
Right, and of course stops funding our enemies as we have done directly and indirectly with Iran, with Hamas, through aid to Gaza that they control, through our energy policy that has enriched Russia and Iran beyond what they would have otherwise realized, thus helping them finance their nefarious activities. Interesting perspective. One more before we get to our next guest. I interviewed Tom Homan, the former acting ICE director under Trump, for my most recent episode of my Counterculture podcast. Really good discussion with Tom. We went on for an hour because he just has so much detailed knowledge of the topic of border security. He served in every presidential administration going back to Reagan. He was actually promoted under Obama, if you can believe that. It's true. Here's what Tom Homan said about being serious about the border, and if he was a GOP member of Congress, what he would demand. Take a listen.
But there should be zero compromise until we secure this border. Like right now, if I was a member of Congress, I was a Republican member of Congress, I wouldn't be sitting down talking about a spending bill. I wouldn't be talking about an infrastructure bill. I wouldn't be sitting down with the Democrats and negotiate anything until they show me one thing they're going to do to secure the border. Look, this security border, like I said before, it's just not about illegal immigration anymore. This is the biggest national security failure this country has seen since 9/11. Do something to secure that border. I'm not going to negotiate squat with you. And you know what? Now that we have the House, we have the purse strings, we'll shut it down. Shut the government down. People say, that's pretty drastic move. How drastic does it have to get when we know that no suspected terrorists are being arrested at record numbers on our border? How drastic does it have to get? If they can penetrate the most sophisticated wall system Israel has, which is just as good as our wall system, actually some of the technology might even be better, if they can penetrate them and they have an intelligence barrier there, you don't think the same thing happened to us, especially when 70 to 90% of agents are off the line? This is a point. So how bad it's got to get? We're there. So Congress needs to demand action or shut it down. That's my opinion.
And he meant 70 to 90% of agents are off the line. Yeah, they become paper pushers to process people into this country. So $1 billion to add more personnel accomplishes nothing with respect to the underlying policy that hamstrings Border Patrol. He went on to say, okay, so here are specific things. I pressed him, but so give me specific things that must be accomplished before you would enter into negotiations about other matters, including this foreign aid that's being debated.
Look, what's happening on the border right now is not a resource issue. It's a policy issue. If they would simply go back to the Trump policies that gave us the most secure border in a lifetime, we'd be there. I'd require, restart the Trump policies. They've proven effective. Mandate E-Verify, finish the wall. Then we'll talk about what you want to do as far as future immigration.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Bradley Bowman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's start with Tom Homan. What's your reaction to that recommendation?
Yeah, no, thank you. I focus on U.S. defense policy and strategy, and so I don't pretend to be an expert on immigration or border security, but I know enough to know that, if we're going to be a nation state that's secure, you got to be able to control who comes into our country. I hosted an event at Foundation for Defense of Democracies on October 11th with the commander of U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson. And one of the things we talked about was Iran's growing activity in Latin America, and as well as Hezbollah's activity there. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if the situation in the Middle East continues to grow worse, that we're going to see growing attempts by Iran and its terror proxies in Latin America to try to come up and get into the United States via our insecure border. So, I agree with him that the Israelis, out of necessity, have had to be very good at building border walls, but we saw the failure of their border wall around Gaza on October 7th with horrific results. And so these things are hard, but I agree with him that they're doable if there's the political will. And the primary problem in terms of the U.S. southern border up to this point is not one of technology or capability, it's political will. So I would agree with him on that.
Yeah, we learned yesterday for Josh Hawley's questioning with Mayorkas that DHS agents are being pulled off of investigating child trafficking to make sandwiches for illegal immigrants. And also a DHS employee posted an image of a Hamas paraglider with a machine gun flying into Israel, and that person hasn't been fired or suspended.
Well, you're right. And actually, students for the so-called college club called Students for Justice in Palestine took that image of the paraglider that you referenced and sent that around to all their little chapters on universities around the country, celebrating that, encouraging people to come rally for that cause. And let's be clear, what did those Hamas terrorists and those paragliders do? They went in and contributed to the largest murder of Jews, single-day murder of Jews since the Holocaust.
Right.
So
it's not a freedom fighter, it's a terrorist.
Exactly. And one only needs to read Hamas's charter to understand that this isn't about a Palestinian state. This is about the extermination of the state of Israel and the murder of Jews. So some of the moral confusion that we're seeing around the world in Europe and also sadly on American college campuses and elsewhere is just really, really, I'd say scary and disappointing. And I think the permissiveness of a lot of college administrators and some of the things we're hearing some professors saying in places like Columbia, it leads to some of these horrible things that we've seen, including at Cornell, for example.
So what about what Leo Leibovitz had to say about not funding Israel, stopping the funding to Israel, as well as Iran and Hamas and so forth? But the point is, I know that the way that American politicians work is we show our support for something by throwing money at it. But Leibovitz is essentially arguing it's doing more harm than good.
Yeah, I don't know him personally. He sounds like a nice gentleman. I think he's dead wrong. I mean, I think he's dangerously wrong. Now you're in the center of my wheelhouse, and I'll just tell you, and I hope your listeners are listening, if you support Israel, do not listen to his advice. He is dead wrong. We provide $3.8 billion in foreign military financing each year to Israel. Right now, we're providing a lot more. I get as much detail as you want. We're providing small diameter bombs, joint direct attack munitions, 155 millimeter artillery shells. Here's the bottom line. The gap between the defense budget Israel needs and the defense budget it has is huge and growing. In other words, obviously, as October 7th demonstrated, Israel is not as secure as we would like. In this moment of increased vulnerability for Israel, would it make sense to cut their defense budget by over $3.8 billion? Absolutely not. And and the kind of the cynical, cheap, easy to make talking point about it's a handout to American defense company. I mean, give me a break. It's about, do you want Israel? Do you believe Israel has a right to exist? Do you believe that Israel should have the means to deprive Hamas and Hezbollah of the means of murder? Do you believe that Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism? If yes, yes, and yes, then you want Israel to have the means to defend itself. So why the heck would it make sense in this moment of vulnerability to slash Israel's defense budget? It's really kind of that simple.
Well, okay. I mean, just to be clear, though, I mean, Leibovitz obviously believes all those things. He's a yes, yes, yes
right.
on
No,
those questions.
I mean, he can be very sincere and good intention. He's just dead wrong.
Okay. I wanted to go to Ukraine. I mean, there was a report earlier this week, unnamed officials in Zelensky's inner circle that are suggesting that the administration and the Ministry of Defense there is beset by corruption. We talked to Steve Bucci from the Heritage Foundation yesterday, and even he said, otherwise sort of inclined to be supportive of additional aid to Ukraine, that there needs to be a real accounting for how the money is spent, how the money is going to be spent, and then a check on how it was spent. Mike Johnson, the newly minted speaker, talked about wanting to get some clarity on the end game from the Biden administration before considering support for additional funding for Ukraine. Are those fair concerns and criticisms?
They can make those criticisms. I know, Steve, of course, anyone paying attention knows that the Heritage Foundation, a place that with strong ties to Ronald Reagan, has turned its back on Ukraine. So it's not surprising that you have experts from the Heritage Foundation saying such things. I worked in the U.S. Senate for 9 years. I'm a former military officer. I begin with the questions of Ukraine with the following. What is in the American national security interest, and what principles are at stake? I would say it's in our interest to deter the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II, which is what we are experiencing. The Biden administration failed to deter that. Is America neutral or not neutral when the Kremlin tries to use military force to redraw borders in Europe? When have we seen efforts to redraw borders in Europe? It's called World War I and World War II. Yeah, those are a little different than we are now, but that's not some territorial dispute. What happened? Well, America eventually entered both World War I and World War II, and more than 500,000 Americans gave their lives. Are there any American service members fighting in Ukraine now? Answer, no. What have we spent on Ukraine? Well, we spent about $44.5 billion in security assistance. The overall tag is larger than that. So how is someone listening supposed to say, is that a lot? Is that a little? Well, that $44.5 billion is roughly 3.5%, give or take, of what we spent on the Pentagon over the same time period. So here's the question for your listeners. Do you think it's worth 3.5% to deal body blows to the second leading conventional military threat the United States confronts, and without endangering a single U.S. service member, and then sending a helpful deterrent message around the world to Beijing, Pyongyang, Tehran, and Kremlin that America will not sit on its hands if you conduct the largest invasion in Europe since World War II? That is a bargain. That is an investment. And frankly, these Breitbart articles that are being sent around about corruption. Is there corruption in Ukraine?
Oh,
Absolutely.
It was time, not Breitbart.
There is corruption in the United States as well. Is corruption a problem? Yes, but there is no evidence of large-scale diversion of weapons. You know why? Because they need the weapons to fight the Russian invading forces. So,
well, let me.
I, for my part, am not going to be one of someone who echoes Vladimir Putin's talking points, because I think abandoning, if you don't like the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the consequences that caused, you're really not going to like the failure of Ukraine to defend their country against a Russian invasion.
Okay, well then let me get more detail from you. So what does the $60-odd billion do? What is the state of play in Ukraine with respect to repelling the Russians? What are we willing to be on the hook for in terms of tell me what it would take to put Ukraine in a stronger position than it is now, where it seems, according to some experts, that the June counteroffensive has been degraded into a war of attrition at present?
Very fair question, a question I welcome, and game on the details. So the answer to your question is 61.4 billion. I can break that down into the 4 or 5 categories that exist. I don't know if we have time for that, but it's $30 billion for Department of Defense equipment for Ukraine and replenishment of U.S. stocks. And let me just foot stomp that. People who oppose supporting Ukraine think they're being real cute and not supporting Ukraine funding. But what they're actually doing, in addition to hurting Ukraine's counteroffensive, they're actually hurting the U.S. military, right? Because the 2 primary means by which we've provided Ukraine weapons is via Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, where you contract with industry, and then Presidential Drawdown Authority, where we send weapons from our own arsenal. So some of those weapons have already gone out the door. And by not supporting funding for Ukraine, all you're doing is preventing the U.S. military from replenishing the older equipment that's already sent to Ukraine with newer equipment, thereby hurting U.S. military readiness. I don't know if a lot of your listeners realize that.
Okay, that's an interesting point. But so then, give us to the extent that's possible. I know these things are difficult to estimate, but where are we? Where is Ukraine? What else will need to be done over what general time period in order to change the seeming trajectory of this effort to repel the Russians?
Yeah. No, thank you for repeating that. I didn't want to talk too long, but I'm absolutely happy to answer that. Here's the bottom line. There's a huge gap between what Ukraine, this will sound familiar what I said earlier, it just happens to also be true in Ukraine. There's a huge gap between what Ukraine needs and what it has to evict Russian forces from all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. So I do not see a quick and short path to that outcome. Why? Well, it's because the Russian military is pretty good at World War I style combat with drones, and that's
a lot bigger.
Vladimir Putin doesn't give a darn about throwing young Russians into the meat grinder. He does not care. He does not have the concerns that the Ukrainian democratic leaders would have about loss of life, and they can do artillery warfare till the cows come home. So the only thing that is certain, in my opinion, is if we stop supporting Ukraine, you'll see some sort of Ukrainian defeat. So, in our microwave culture here in the U.S., we want a solution tomorrow. Sorry, sometimes there aren't quick solutions. But what is certain is if we abandon Ukraine, a lot of our European allies will follow, and things will only get worse there. And you could eventually see the collapse of a major European capital. That's failure. So, this ending endless war narrative, it's a little bit silly, right? Because there's not a single American fighting in Ukraine. So the bottom line is, if we want to have a negotiated solution, I would say you want Ukraine to be as powerful as possible going to that solution. And you will simply undercut the Ukrainian position, and empower Putin if you deprive Ukraine of the resources it needs. So, I worked on the Hill for 9 years. If you don't like a policy, the first thing you talk about is oversight and accountability. Yes, there's always room for improvement. But the bottom line is we're confronting an unprovoked Kremlin aggression against a beleaguered democracy. How does America feel about that? How does that affect our interests? And what will Beijing conclude if America, after a year and a half of making a good show for it, says, we kind of lost interest. We don't really have the staying power. How does that inform their decision in Taiwan? And I'll tell you, if we don't want to send our sons and daughters to war in the Taiwan Strait, don't ignore the deterrent message that we'll send to Beijing by a failure to stick with Ukraine for the medium term. So can we afford 3.5% for Ukraine for the next 5 to 10 years? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. But that doesn't mean I see a victory next week. And anyone who's saying there will be is not telling you the truth.
Bradley Bowman is Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Bradley Bowman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
Tune into Protect and Grow with Tim Stearns every Saturday at noon on AM 560 The Answer. Certified financial planning professional Tim Stearns holds weekly discussions of the financial challenges to a secure retirement. Learn about planning strategies and solutions that proactive investors utilize to help make continued progress toward retirement goals. Call with questions at 800-640-2256 or visit tjstearns.com. Protect and Grow with Tim Stearns,